Hello and welcome. We are going to hang out for about an hour and talking about Every Brain Belongs, creating some neurodivergent affirming worship. We're going to start with some introductions, go through a couple of definitions, talk a little bit about why this even matters. Why are we even talking about this? I'll go through my framework for creating some neurodivergent affirming worship and worship practices with the Bridge framework, talk about some tools and resources and practices, and allow some time for some questions at the end, as well as some questions throughout the session today. So, if you're into that, let's go ahead and get started. So, I want to just point out some ground rules here just a little bit. So, you are invited to participate as you are able and as you are today. So, I just opened up the chat. Cameras are optional. We're in a webinar format anyway, so I can't see any of your faces. So feel free to do exactly what you need to do in your space to stay engaged, to stay here, and to stay informed. So movements and fidgets are welcome. I have my magnets here, so if you hear clicking, if you hear random clicking, it's because I have magnets in my hand that I'm playing with. And I'm sorry if that's distracting. I try to keep them out of the sound field. Um, Chat participation is encouraged, so please drop your questions, comments, concerns, your cheers, your yays, your emojis, whatever you want to in the chat. And I can respond there. I will try to keep an eye on that. Um, Also, understand that silence is respected. If you don't have anything that you want to share, if you don't want to participate in any of the kind of pause and reflection moments, that doesn't mean that you're not actually pausing and actually reflecting and actually um, included in this session. And I fully know and understand that. So you are able to participate as you are. We're going to start, speaking of participation, with a little bit of some introductions. So there's about 10 of us in the room. So I want to see kind of who's here, what your expectations are, and kind of what's going on with you. So let's start by dropping your name and pronouns in the chat if that's not already connected to you, your current location. So if you're in Portland, awesome. I am not in Portland. I am in very cold, very snowy Grand Rapids, Michigan right now. Um, but where are you? I'm very curious. And then what you're hoping to get from our time together from our session. So I'm really curious about who's in the room and what you're looking for today. Um, while you all are typing those things out, if you're looking to um, participate that way, I will give that information from myself. Hi, I'm Erin. My pronouns are she or they. Just like I said, I am in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I am a worship leader. I'm a DEI consultant, and I am an ADHD coach, and I love, love, love doing inclusive work in ministries and churches and have been doing DEI work for the better part of 20 years, doing this work in churches for a long time as well. And I'm excited to share this part of my work with you all today. So we have some folks in the room in Portland. We have some fellow Michiganders in the room. Hello, good afternoon slash evening. Um, so it looks like we're looking for some resources for ourselves, looking for some resources for churches and worshiping spaces. So we're kind of coming into the right space today. I love that for all of us. Um, so as we're continuing, I have one more question. One more question. I know I'm asking for a lot right now, but I want to ask, when worship works for you, I'm kind of shifting a little bit into the actual presentation. When worship works for you, so wherever, whatever reason you're going into a worship space, whatever reason you're going to church, whatever reason you might be going to like I'm thinking about even going to like a college worship night, going back to those days. When worship works for you, what does it feel like? So take a couple of minutes and think about that and drop that answer into the chat for me whenever you um, can come up with some of those words. Okay, okay. So worship feels like you're getting to do something with your hands. You get to think or sing, you get to sing and clap, something movement based. Okay, that's fair. So when worship works for you, it's something um, singing or movement. Okay, I could see that. All encompassing. Okay, you're only there. I like that. So you're focused enough that you're just at that space. I love that. Okay. Like a good workout. That's fair. That's absolutely fair. I have my Apple Watch when I was in my Apple Watch days has absolutely mistaken um, good worship for me um, like an actual workout. And then I continued reading your comment and realizing that that's not what you meant, but that's perfectly okay. Um, but like a good workout, you've been spiritually stretched in a good way and it requires energy, but you know that that will be rebounded later. Erin is saying worship, when it works for you, is real. It's not scary. It's not a scary building or loud. It's calming. Okay. I love all of those. I love all of those. So for those, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. Um, it can be both, yeah, literally and a metaphorical workout, absolutely. Um, but for those of you who are still thinking, feel free to think and continue to drop your answers in the chat if you would like. But for me, worship should feel like a Sabbath and a sanctuary. It should feel like rest. And for some of us, the workout of it can still be rest and release. And it shouldn't feel like a chore or something to get through. And that's a lot of what I hear um, in some of the ADHD spaces specifically that I'm in, and some of the wider neurodivergent spaces that I'm in, is that church in and of itself can be a bit of a chore and can be a bit scary or loud, and it's not necessarily always that calming experience that we love. I'm sorry if you all are seeing my switching happening on the screen and if that's distracting. But what I want to do is move through, and some of you talked a little bit about, trying to make worship more neurodivergent friendly beyond just saying bring your fidgets, beyond just having bring your fidgets and bring your earplugs and oh yeah, your noise canceling headphones are absolutely welcome here. Bring everything that you need to bring and keeping it all on the onus of the neurodivergent person in there. um, this session is about taking one more step in our churches from this all are welcome thing that we see and we hear and we understand, and moving it into practices that make this belonging real. And I know we as queer folks especially have a little bit of a qualm with this concept of all are welcome because sometimes that word all has not meant all in our history and in our past, right? So we want to make sure that we are saying literally all people are welcome here. All people are welcome here. And we want to make sure that that is 100% real as we're doing this. Um, So going back into the chat, if you write and listen, okay, if you like you're doing now, well, so doing jigsaw puzzles in the back of the sanctuary during worship, love that. Yes. You can think better during the sermon, be present better. Absolutely. I have my iPad on me on a lot, and I end up doing like digital coloring books during the sermon is another thing that I'll do. So I will sometimes have the magnets in one hand and the Apple Pencil in the other, and I'm literally coloring and making art and figuring out how I can take some of the things that are happening in the service and make them into art in the moment. And it works out really well for me too. Are there any questions that anybody has before we kind of move on? And this is not a one and done thing. If you have questions at any time, feel free to drop them into the chat. Janaba says, I always, always take notes during worship, and it makes me sad when people are like, oh, do you think there's a test? No, I want to remember what happened. Absolutely. I do not control the remember. I am more likely to remember what I want to remember if I write it down. But then there's the caveat of remembering that I wrote it down and then remembering where I wrote it down. But it's all good. Quiet was mentioned, but so much of the music last night was too loud for me. How to balance? That is absolutely fair. Um, and that's one of those things of sometimes we can um, sometimes we can make a sensory change to make people more comfortable, and sometimes we can't. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes the space doesn't make it possible. I've worshiped in spaces that were just loud spaces. So we did what we could to mitigate the loudness in the room. But because of how small the room was and how loud it was, the room itself was really, really hard to balance. So, one of the things that we did was we noticed and we understood that the room itself was loud. So, we provided some earplugs. So, we had some of those things available. We didn't necessarily have people say, oh, bring your own earplugs. We know the room is going to be loud. We had some available in the back. And in kind of our little sensory station next to our fidgets and next to our coloring books, we just had earplugs and we made them available. Sometimes it's not always changing the big sound system in the room. Sometimes oh no, I'm not talking about at QCF. Sorry, I'm talking about um, at my church when I've done this. They might have earplugs available. Feel free to ask. Um, so sorry about that, about the confusion. But sometimes when we're designing worship and when we're putting things together in spaces, it's not always about saying, oh, we allow the earplugs or we allow them. Sometimes it's about providing them in the space when you know that you're not always going to be able to change your levels to make them um, as welcoming to all people. There are earplugs available on the plaza level with the first time in at the first timers table with the pronoun pin. So there are earplugs available if you need that at the conference. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that information. And I hope you are able to get the sensory support you need. I'm excited about that. Um, so let's talk briefly about what neurodivergence is. Um, yeah, let's talk a little bit about neurodivergence and understanding it just a little bit more as we're going throughout here. So I have three big terms that I actually want to define. So three big terms I want to define as we go through this. The first word I want to define is neurodiversity. Neurodiversity, um, it describes the cognitive differences between how people think, learn, and behave. Neurodiversity describes the cognitive differences between how people think, learn, and behave. And sociologist Judy Singer is credited with inventing this term in 1998. And if you think about it, if you just take the last part of that word, diversity, diversity literally means difference. As a diversity educator and consultant, I have this conversation all the time with people when we talk about diversity, especially in of humans. Literally, we're talking about difference. We tack that neuro onto the front of it, and we're talking about differences in how brains work and function. So, neurodiversity, a difference in how brains function. And in the wonderful, wonderful world of human behavior that likes binaries, there are two categories, two bigger, broader categories within neurodiversity. Number one, which number one is neurotypical. So, neurotypical describes people who process information in a way that is considered standard or typical for their age group. So, someone who is neurotypical develops brain functions like social and organizational skills, like emotional intelligence, like executive functions at similar rates to others at their same age group. Whereas neurodivergent people process that same information and go through those same life skills in a way that's not typical for someone their age. So this variation could include a diagnosed condition or diagnosed or diagnosable condition like autism or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are many others. We'll go through another list. However, neurodivergence is never going to show up on a diagnostic list. No one is ever going to get diagnosed as neurodivergent. Check. There might be multiple diagnoses that live under the neurodivergent umbrella. Um, but unfortunately, in anybody's medical chart, you're never going to see the word neurodivergence as at least as of today, right now, as an actual medical diagnosis. It's more of a social descriptor overall. All right, so the word um, neurodivergent is credited to Cassian. Whew, I have practiced this name over and over again, and right now my mouth is going to struggle saying it. Asasimasu. If anybody knows how to say this name and I'm saying it incorrectly, please correct me once again. Um, but this person is credited with coming up with the term in the early 2000s. So just a little bit of history of the terminology there for you. I talked about there is an umbrella with neurodivergence, and there is a variety of diagnoses that do fall under what could be called the neurodivergent umbrella. We talk about autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder being kind of the big two that people understand under the neurodivergent umbrella. Some lesser known ones that could fall under that umbrella are obsessive compulsive disorder, a variety of learning disabilities, in this case, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia, which are dyslexia is a learning disability that has struggles with reading and language. Dysgraphia describes struggles with writing and fine motor skills. So yeah, writing and fine motor skills. Dyscalculia is struggles with numbers and math. And dyspraxia is struggles with some of those gross motor skills. So all of those fall under and can fall under a neurodivergent umbrella. Tourette's syndrome and other tic disorders are included, as well as a variety of intellectual disabilities, sensory processing disorders, and there are also what are called acquired neurodivergences. So a lot of what I just named are inherent neurodivergences, things that people are born with or that are diagnosed very, very young. There are other acquired neurodivergences that can show up as we get older. So mood disorders, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders can fall under neurodivergence as well as trauma. So trauma disorders, PTSD, and complex trauma or CPTSD, which also is not in the DSM, the complex part of PTSD, by the way. So that was a crash course and a lot of information. So I want to pause for a moment again and allow some time for A, information processing, and B, if you have any questions or anything to kind of bring up or discuss, feel free to drop those in the chat or drop them in the Q&A box. That's an option too. Yep, yep. Um, So I was in my mid 40s before being diagnosed with ADHD, partial masking ability, question mark, partial perimenopause affecting my levels. Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that I found out throughout this journey is that for my AFAB folks, for my AFAB people, I was diagnosed with ADHD at 36 and found out that Dopamine, which is the chemical that ADHD is deficient in. Our brains do not make the correct amount to be able to function neurotypically. But dopamine and estrogen are linked. Those two things go together. Um, so as estrogen drops, as AFAB people get older, the dopamine goes with it. The same goes so throughout monthly cycles for AFAB folks that still have the monthly cycle throughout the month. As estrogen goes up, dopamine, levels out, and as estrogen goes down, dopamine goes down. So the emotional roller coaster that happens for my AFAB people with ADHD, it is real and it sucks. And it impacts focus, it impacts mood, it impacts the ability to mask. It impacts the ability to handle some of the sensory differences that can happen throughout living. Yeah, there's a lot that can get answered even just with a diagnosis and with knowing. Um, Janaba is inching towards an autism diagnosis, and so much of the wrangling has been realizing that millennial youth was neurodivergent kids who are structured, or neurodivergent kids are the ones who are bad at structures like school. And because I was really good at structures like school, clearly I was fine. Yes. Oh, honey, the gifted and talented program to ADHD and autism diagnosis pipeline is strong. It is very strong. Me and my entire class have had many, many conversations about that. I love it. Keep the stories and comments coming. I will come back to that. We'll come back to those. But let's talk about how these things can impact worship because we like to think that worship spaces are neutral. Worship spaces are not neutral. Kind of like schools are not neutral. Schools are incredibly structured, and we really think about schools being neutral spaces. They are not. Similarly to worship spaces are designed, intentionally or not, around some assumptions. So we talk about assumptions and about masking and about some of these structures. So I want to kind of put this back to you all. This is a workshop. I'm a very collaborative and participatory presenter. So drop in the chat, drop in the question box, take some notes. Um, what are some of the unspoken expectations in your worship spaces? What are some of the unspoken expectations and rules in your worship spaces? Yep. Being quiet, staying in your seat, don't move outside of your personal space box. Stand and sit when appropriate and be non-disruptive. Able-bodiedness. Yep, yes, there's a ramp to get to the chancel, but if you want to get to the choir loft, you have to leave the sanctuary to go up a different ramp, to go over the river and through the woods, to be able to take the communion, to do this. Uh-huh, absolutely. So, yeah, what else? That's fair. That's fair. I'm not always sure I can see the unspoken expectations because I'm too close. That is fair. And thank you for saying that out loud. Be quiet, stay in the pew and listen. The building was built in the 30s. Ah, okay. So absolutely, you have to stay in the pew and listen because if you breathe too loudly, the pews are going to creak and the wood is going to happen and it's going to be disruptive. Not moving around. I grew up in a very, very Black Baptist church and it almost seemed rude to not know the rules in my experience. So there were certain times when you could and couldn't even go into and out of the sanctuary, and the ushers are going to hold the door and they're gonna look at you and they're gonna look at you sideways if you try to go in to the door when you shouldn't go in, even though even though they're standing right there saying yes and no, if I try to go around because I don't understand the rules, then I look like the jerk for not knowing what's going on rather than someone not explaining to me, hey, actually, we don't go in the sanctuary when someone is praying because we think that that is irreverent, right? Let's see what else. Often assumptions of hearing and being able to see, right? So we don't prioritize live captioning or evening virtual options. Seeing the death of hybrid options, even after COVID, makes me so sad from a disability perspective. Yeah. So the hybrid options are starting to kind of dwindle rather than kind of seeing the improvement and getting better. Um, there's also this expectations of the culture versus the space, like how the church I serve was very keen on how people were dressed. Whew. Ooh, the dress code is real. I had a parishioner tell me I needed to shine my shoes if I was going to wear them to preach. And he really did show up with the polish at one point. Seriously. Wow. The audacity. The video camera that posted live online is also a problem. Okay, interesting. Say more if you can on that one. Say more on that one. Um, but lots of unspoken expectations. And even when the expectations are spoken, sometimes they're not always spoken with the best of tone in mind, not necessarily meaning to tone police, but sometimes it's not always about reverence or talking to or disrespect of God. A lot of times it's disrespect of culture, disrespect of what I am used to, disrespect of me and my space. We talked about some of these already, but most worship spaces quietly expect some of these things. They quietly expect the stillness. They quietly expect the silence. They quietly expect linear focus and being able to go into a straight line. Um, they quietly expect a high sensory tolerance. So the bright and flashing lights. I'm thinking about the even the mega church experience of the smoke machines and the bright lights and um, the high sensory environments and smoke machines even have sometimes a weird smell to them. So we quietly expect churchgoers to be able to handle some of those things, and that's not always possible. Thank you for clarifying in the chat. You're not wanting strangers to see you act outside of neurotypical worship. That makes sense. Okay. So not necessarily wanting the unmasked worship recorded. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, when these things, these stillnesses, the silences, the linear focus, the high sensory tolerance, when that's the norm, sometimes us neurodivergent folks, we can experience worship as distracting, as overwhelming, as straight up exhausting, as sometimes emotionally unsafe even. We get to the point where we're starting to internalize some of these negative messages that maybe I'm too much, right? Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe God is far away from me. Maybe God can't find me. Maybe I'm not spiritual enough. Maybe this brain of mine isn't something that God created as good. And maybe I'm a struggle, right? So really we talk about this and we talk about this as a faith issue, and it's not a faith issue. We talk about excluding neurodivergent people, or as sometimes it's a discipline issue of the neurodivergent person being excluded. Or it's a motivation issue. I've heard that sometimes we just need to focus more. We just need to do a little bit more. It's not any of these things. Really, exclusion in worship is a design issue. It's a design issue. And if something can be designed, it can be redesigned. If we can put something together, then we can take it apart and we can put it together again in a way that works for more people. The one thing about accessibility and the one thing about diversity and all of these things is we are never going to get it 100% right. We will never get it 100% right. Does that mean we don't try? Absolutely not. That doesn't mean we don't try, but that means we do our best with everything we know right now. And then next time we hear something went wrong, next time we hear that there's an issue, we do our best with everything we know now. And then next time we come up with something, we do our best with everything we know now. So it's about iterating and reiterating and reiterating and continuing to do our best to serve and include all of God's children. So if we go into this with looking at worship and being redesigned and the design of worship, worship in general as a church, worship shapes belonging and the culture of how we do that. Design of worship communicates the theology and how we do what we do and how we believe what we believe and how we actually embody Christ in our lives. And one last thing, we remember that accessibility is a biblical command. We think about in Mark 2 and in Luke 5, where this man's friends lowered him through a roof to get to Jesus. Everybody deserves access to Jesus. Accessibility is a biblical command. So the more that we lean into that biblical command, the better our churches will ultimately do. So, hey, Erin, how do we do this? This is really hard. This is a lot. I know, and that's okay. And that's why I'm here. And we're going to talk about bridges. We'll talk a little bit about the bridge framework and how we can start to put this all together. So before I go into this, we're a little bit over halfway through our time, but in the chat a little bit ago, I dropped it in at 7:43, so about 10 minutes ago, I dropped a link for a PDF that you guys can use, you all can use to take some notes. It has a lot of the framework information in it. It has a lot of the information from the slides already in there. Um, so if you want to use that to follow along, if you want to use that to take notes, or if you want to use that to show to your church leadership and any other ministry partners that you have where you want to start to do this work, I invite you to do so. Um, but let's get into the bridge. So, step number one, B, is building awareness. So, we start to build awareness by listening to neurodivergent voices and examining our assumptions. Um, Sometimes that's hard. Um, Sometimes that's really hard. And I appreciate, who said it earlier? I'm scrolling through the chat. Um, I appreciate whoever said it earlier and said that they were too close to sometimes see what some of the unspoken expectations are. I'm trying to scroll through to see who it was. Um, if you want to claim that comment, I appreciate that one because listening to the neurodivergent voices and examining the assumptions is really the step out of that. But we can ask our neurodivergent congregants what helps or hinders their worship. We can notice who might leave early, who's disengaging, who might be kind of having some of those reactions and responses to maybe being sensorily overwhelmed or not being comfortable. Um, Reflect on the assumptions of what reverence looks like in a space. What does attention look like in a space? So we are including neurodivergent voices and skills in our worship planning. I led a very, 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 very neurodivergent worship team. And as I was worship planning, I would always check to see, okay, what's going on with you all this week? How is this going to work? Are we feeling good about this or do we need to change things? Um, as well as offering the ability to provide feedback anonymously. Um, Especially for folks with ADHD, we get into rejection sensitivity. So if we're able to give our honest feedback without that fear of immediate rejection, that can sometimes start conversations and we'll be able to go back and give more feedback later once we know that that initial kind of rejection hump has been jumped over. So B, we're building awareness. All right. After we build some awareness, we're going to start to remove some barriers. So we start to reduce unnecessary sensory and participation obstacles. So, and I use the word unnecessary because sometimes we can adjust the lighting and the sound and things like that only so much within a space, but we start to reduce how much we flood a space with sensory information. So we adjust the lighting, the volume, the visual stimulation. We reduce the strong scents. So if we're using a lot of incense, maybe we keep it to one side of the room versus having it in the middle. Maybe we keep the candles up front rather than along the sides of the sanctuary if possible. Maybe we tell the church mothers to put on 7 pumps of perfume on Sundays instead of 8. Maybe we start to make that request for example, right? Um, so some participation obstacles might be not knowing where we're going next. So clearly naming transitions, clearly naming some of those expectations during worship, giving a bit of an orientation to the space before worship starts. Offering flexible seating. I am quick to sit on a floor, honey. I am quick to pull up a carpet. Um, and I invite other folks to join me there too. Removing the pressure to stand, sit, or and respond verbally if necessary. I use the term shift your posture when I'm leading worship. And that is simply inviting folks to adjust their bodies in the way that reminds them what they're doing. Sometimes that's standing. With my congregation, I said that a lot, and they knew that if I said shift your posture and they were able to stand, or if I were in a more traditional church scenario, I would say stand. Um, but I say shift your posture and say, okay, cool. If that just means rolling your shoulders back, if that means bowing your head, if that means I need to lay out on the floor for this moment to get my body where it needs to be, if that means that I can stand, then I do what I need to do to make sure my body is participating as well as my brain. Speaking of, we're including all brains. That's the I in bridge. And we include all brains by offering multiple ways to engage and participate, which we started to talk about with removing the barriers, but we normalize movements. We normalize fidgets. It's not just saying, yeah, bring your fidgets or even adding them, but it's making sure that anyone can use them and they're not just for the kids. So if I'm there and I have my fidgets, I have a bunch that I keep in my church pouch that I will offer to anyone that I see might look like they need something to do with their hands, whether they have told me that they're neurodivergent or not. Providing lyrics and prayers and readings both visually and verbally. And this is something that a lot of churches do now with having either an order of worship or having a slideshow. Um, but not everywhere does it. I've been places that don't actually have all of those things available. Offer alternatives to spoken responses. So if we're in our environments where we can do chat responses or journaling or some sort of art, uh, using plain language, regular language alongside our high theological language that we sometimes get into, and naming from the pulpit, from up front, from a microphone, an important person in your church naming from the microphone that different attention styles are welcomed and are wonderfully included parts of the body of Christ. So, preaching about neurodivergent experiences, if you can, using um, neurodivergent experiences like you might use like racism and ableism as um, examples in sermons and things like that. So, making sure that you are including all brains and all experiences throughout worship. Design worship with care. So this is when we're getting into the redesigning of worship. So including intentional pacing, clear transitions, and predictable structures as we're going along. So we're sharing a clear order of worship in advance if possible, or as early as possible. I did that at the beginning when I ran down kind of what we were going to do today, what we're going to do in this hour, using consistent rhythms and cues from week to week to create some sort of rhythm. Um, Building in pauses for movement or sensory rest, keeping instructions short and concrete, and we're balancing stimulation with moments of quiet. This can go in both more traditional church settings as well as more of the charismatic church settings. You might think of, if you've never been to a charismatic service, you might think that that is wild and chaotic and there's not any consistent rhythms or anything like that. But if you've been to a charismatic church service, if you've been to a Pentecostal service, you know that there are actually consistent rhythms and cues. And it's just making sure that those are actually consistent and actually followed on a regular basis. We can move with the Holy Spirit and we can do the spontaneity piece of worship and we can still have the consistent rhythms to signal the safety. We can do both. It's absolutely possible. The G in Bridge talks about growing capacity, and we grow capacity through training leaders and building shared responsibility. You being in this room right now, being in this space right now, is growing capacity. Thank you. Thank you for doing that work. If you go back to your churches and you take this back to them, thank you for working to train your leaders and to grow your capacity. So we're training worship leaders and volunteers on accessibility in general, making sure that they know and understand what are the accessibility needs of your congregation, of your guests that might come in, and what do we have in place at our church to be able to support that. Um, Accessibility is not one person's job, it is everyone's job. All staff members, all leaders, all volunteers. It is everyone's job. Um, Offer ongoing learning about neurodivergence, encouraging leaders to ask for feedback without defensiveness. That's the big piece, is without defensiveness. And that one is hard. Getting feedback without defensiveness can be really, really difficult. Um, and that takes some time and effort to actually do. And then we normalize accessibility as part of discipleship. So this isn't something that should be tokenized. This isn't something that we're only going to talk about during 1 month of the year or anything like that. This should be something that is talked about on a regular basis at, at staff meetings every single time. And then once we've done all of that, we need to make sure that we are evaluating and evolving. So we're inviting feedback, reflection, and ongoing change. Regular feedback from neurodivergent congregants and neurodivergent families. Reflect as a team on what worked, what didn't, and what you're going to change going forward. And make sure those changes are small and sustainable. So we don't want to make an overhaul change and then not be able to actually sustain what we're trying to do, right? And then we treat accessibility, like we said, as an ongoing practice, not a one-time tokenized thing. We've got about 10 minutes left here, and I want to open up the floor for both some questions and a little bit of discussion, as well as one more kind of pause and reflect right now. And what do you think the next steps might be for your worshiping community? So, whatever questions you might have, as well as some reflection moments. My answer begins with the sharing. I learned a lot from doing mediation with kids in behavioral health hospitals. The kids were almost all displaced from their homes, which were abusive or neglectful, which exacerbated the inability to mask their neurodivergence. So I broke the silent meditation. Oh, it was meditation, not mediation, my bad. Meditation with movement. Yes, I handed out fidgets. I tried focus practices with stories, and they fly and run and play in their minds. It really changed what I think about worship, spiritual practices, and prayer. Absolutely. Oh yeah, I prayer is not a still or silent thing in my house. I will absolutely have twerking worship in my living room on a regular basis. Um, Yeah. Janaba, one of the things I hear a lot working in a century plus old building is that we can't do much with the design. Yep. What language would you suggest about, yeah, we can't overhaul a neo-Gothic sanctuary with bolted pews, but we can do something. Yeah, so design isn't necessarily always going to be talking about a physical space. So a lot of what I just spoke of, it as talk of design was actually things that people can do. I would say um, start with the design of the worship service itself more than the design of the space. So, some of the more verbal things I was talking about, I don't know if you have um, slides in your sanctuary or something like that, if you have a public space or like some sort of public display. What can you change about that public display to make it more affirming? If you have a bulletin or something like that, what could you change or update about your bulletin to make that more better? So, yeah, more better. Yep, just said that. Um, so not necessarily talking about a remodel of your Gothic sanctuary. Absolutely not. That sounds beautiful and gorgeous. Um, but what can you do as part of the rest of your worship needs? If you can't adjust the sound in the sanctuary, can you have a sensory space that includes earplugs and sunglasses for folks to be able to support themselves if they need to? Um, I hope that helps. Um, we have a sermon response and prep suggestion meeting with the pastor. I think a worship one would be a good one to have. We are small, no other staff. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I have one of the things in the PDF that I dropped was actually a checklist to be able to go through um, with the pastor to say, here are some things that we could do to make our services more neurodivergent affirming. This is not an exhaustive list, and it is not even all the things that I added also aren't going to be affirming for every neurodivergent person. Um, you meet one neurodivergent person and get all of their needs met, and then you meet another neurodivergent person and they are going to have potentially wildly different needs. So it's how can we make things more flexible and overall more explained so that everyone kind of understands what's going on and everyone has the ability to meet their needs within the space. Or we can say, maybe just this isn't the worship style for you. Let's work together to find you another worshiping community that maybe has a worship style that you need. Maybe this isn't what you need on Sunday mornings and it's just what you're used to. Um, and that is also care. That is also care. As much as that might suck to say, helping someone find a worshiping community that can meet their needs if you can't as a church. That sucks. It does. Um, and not every church has the resources to meet every need. And I know that as well. Um, what other questions or thoughts or concerns do we have? Okay, the struggle we're having right now with having these conversations is that the folks who show up to learn about neurodivergence are folks who are already somewhat knowledgeable and excited about the prospect of making changes to our space and making the service more inclusive. The leaders who are more resistant because of their false assumptions don't come even when invited. Getting all of those voices in the same room has been a challenge. Yeah, yeah. So I think some of the issues there, it seems like what's showing up is that the folks who are more resistant are kind of sort of making some of these assumptions. Some of some of these assumptions are kind of being externalized in saying, well, they're having struggles just because they're not focused enough, just because they're not, and having, especially when we're talking about adults, adults with ADHD and autism and adults who are neurodivergent and adults who can't focus are a lot less accepted and taken care of than the kids who can't focus. So I think for those leaders who are looking at the false assumptions, it's helping them see that these things are not personal flaws and personal failings, that these are actual. Oh my gosh, yes, the growing out of it. But these are actual struggles that happen during church services, and to see um, what is actually going on. And this might be where the conversations with neurodivergent church members might happen, or this might be where you have some more of those stealth, smaller things. So this is maybe where you start to do some of the normalization of things. You start to make sure your congregation isn't looking sideways when somebody walks into the indoor space in sunglasses. Um, or where you start to have earplugs available for everyone when you have your kids' sensory bag stations. Um, or maybe you even say at your kids' sensory bag station that, hey, these are open for everyone to use. So some of those might be some of the smaller changes that maybe you start to get through to your staff and your leadership to start to change some of those mindsets. And it's really frustrating that we can't go from here with the 0 to 1 billion, but how can we go from 0 to 1? And then next time we go from 1 to 2 so that eventually we can make some bigger progress. And that can be really hard to have to inch people forward. Um, the PDF that I dropped also had a bunch of tools and resources in it. Like I said, there was a checklist in there, so I call it an accessibility checklist for worship, as well as some actionable strategies and some ways to actually um, implement some of these things and some ideas. There's also what I call a neurodivergent experience lens. And it is just kind of a way to help you see some of those things and some of those unspoken experiences. And it doesn't even, the way I wrote it, it didn't even necessarily say that this person that you're kind of using as this lens, you're not necessarily always going to be a neurodivergent person. I think even one of the profiles that I put on the page is, what if this is a first-time visitor who doesn't know church norms? That is can be just as jarring of a first-time experience as um, having some neurodivergent troubles in there. So I wanted to include some resources in there. I also included some lists with some books and some podcasts, some websites and organizations, as well as some other people that I didn't necessarily highlight their work in here. Um, some of this work I've engaged with, some of it I have not, I will say. Um, I am expanding my own network of resources for neurodivergent Christianity. There's not a whole lot out there. And what I have found is either kind of old and even has some kind of outdated language or is very, very new. Um, I think as with COVID and when 2020 hit and all of those things, there was an explosion of diagnoses and wonderings of, am I neurodivergent? All of these things. I got caught up in that. I got diagnosed as kind of part of that wave of post-COVID people. And there are a lot of resources that are coming out um, and are being created. This I am kind of part of that, and this is part of that wave and movement. And I am that is one of the books that's on my list. And I have read it, and I love a lot of the things that she says. I went to her webinar that she did recently with the UCC, and I loved it. So yeah, Blessed Minds is an amazing, amazing book. And if you have not read through it, it has some incredible theological thoughts about neurodivergence and worship, and it's amazing. Um, Going back to the chat real quick, we have noise canceling headphones only for kids, but tiny steps. And while most of them got stolen, for a while most of them got stolen, and this is why we can't have nice things. How can we have a better conversation that it's a legit worthwhile investment, and failing it once doesn't mean stop? Yeah, that is a larger conversation to have. And maybe it's a conversation to have, okay, how can we actually increase some of the security on this? Because if they got lost or stolen, okay, how can we take better care of our stuff versus, oh no, it didn't work. So part of that is, okay, maybe we're asking the wrong questions and trying to solve the wrong problem because the problem isn't the headphones, the problem is that they got lost. So how can we create some accountability around making sure they get back to where they're supposed to go? Um, so instead of throwing the whole problem away, maybe we solve the actual problem versus throwing the whole thing away. Um, So, and I think part of that is not knowing and still, yeah, not knowing and not understanding how this can actually be supportive. Um, the other thing might be doing earplugs rather than headphones, so that if they get lost or stolen, it's a little bit less expensive to replace. Um, so we are at our time, friends. So for those of you that are still here, thank you. I appreciate you coming and hanging out. Um, for those of you that have questions or comments or concerns, I have my email and information in that document, so I will leave that in the chat. I will actually just drop my info in the chat. You are welcome. I was excited to be here. Um, Here is my email. Reach out if you have questions or comments or concerns. I love having these types of conversations and trying to make all of our churches more inclusive for all of God's children. Um, I am excited to be here. Thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your conference.